The Indian subcontinent has given the world a rich heritage in philosophy, culture, and religion, from the ancient Vedic tradition to Buddhism and Hinduism. One of the key elements of this diversity is the linguistic division between the two main language families of the region. In northern India, Indo-European languages predominate, such as Sanskrit, Pali, Hindi, and Punjabi. They are related to the languages spoken in Iran and Europe, which suggests a possible common origin. At the same time, the southern part of the subcontinent speaks languages of the Dravidian family, such as Tamil, Telugu, and Kannada. So how did Indo-European languages appear in India? This question remains the subject of intense academic debate. For a long time, the Aryan invasion theory dominated, according to which speakers of Indo-European languages came to India from the West more than 3,000 years ago. According to this hypothesis, the Aryans were warlike nomads who destroyed the Indus Valley civilization and subjugated the local peoples. Many aspects of this theory are disputed, and alternative explanations are becoming increasingly popular. In this episode, we will examine the main arguments for and against, explore archaeological, genetic, and linguistic evidence, and try to answer the main question: was there really an Aryan invasion? You are on the Amazing History channel, and today we will look into one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world, the origins of the Indo-Aryan peoples. Support the channel with likes, subscriptions, and kind comments. This helps us release new exciting videos. Let's go! To understand the origin of the Indo-Aryan peoples, let's first look at the main theories, the Indo-Aryan migration theory. This hypothesis suggests that in the Late Bronze Age, speakers of Indo-European languages migrated to South Asia. These peoples, who were later called the Indo-Aryans, were one of the branches of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, an ancient people who also gave rise to the Iranians, Slavs, Germanic peoples, Greeks, and other ethno-linguistic groups. According to this theory, the homeland of the Proto-Indo-Europeans was located somewhere in the area of modern southern Ukraine, southern Russia, or Central Asia. In the middle of the 3rd and the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, their descendants began to migrate, including movement toward India through Bactria and Margiana. If this is the case, then their arrival coincided with the late stage of the Harappan civilization, which at that time was in decline. In the 19th century, a theory was formed based on this hypothesis. According to this version, the Aryans arrived in India as military conquerors and supposedly destroyed the remnants of the Indus civilization, replacing it with Vedic culture. However, modern research does not support the scenario of a violent invasion. In contrast to this, in recent decades, the hypothesis of autochthony or local Aryan origin has emerged. This hypothesis claims the Aryans were native to India and part of the Harappan civilization, not outsiders. This concept is closely linked to modern Indian nationalism, which rejects the idea of a foreign origin of Vedic culture. The debates between the supporters of these theories are complex and multi-layered. In the 19th century, colonial historians often portrayed the Indo-Aryans as a civilizing force that brought order to the barbarian peoples of India. This concept has faced sharp criticism, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries. On the other hand, some supporters of the autochthonous hypothesis try to present the Aryans as an indigenous Indian people, rejecting any external influences. However, the historical reality is much more complex. The culture of India has always been influenced by neighboring civilizations, whether it be Persia, Greece, China, or the Arab world. To get to the bottom of the issue, let's look at the actual evidence: archaeological and linguistic evidence, historical and genetic data. One of the key methods for studying the origins of the Indo-Aryans is philology, the science of ancient texts. In this case, the main source is the Vedas, the oldest sacred scriptures of Hinduism. Most researchers date them to the period between 1500 and 1200 BCE. In the Vedic texts, many deities are similar to the gods of the ancient Greek and other Indo-European pantheons. This indicates cultural connections between the Indo-Aryans and their distant relatives in Europe and Iran. In addition, linguistic analysis of Sanskrit shows its relationship to the Old Persian language. This gives us an idea about the migration routes of the Indo-Aryans and their contacts with other peoples. The Vedas mention various groups, including the Dasas. They are described as enemies of the Aryans, practicing distinctive religious traditions. This may indicate a clash of cultures, but who the Dasas were is unknown. Some hypotheses suggest that they could have been Iranians, peoples of Central Asia, or pre-Indo-Aryan inhabitants of India. However, it's important to understand that the description of wars in the Vedas does not mean that the Aryans destroyed the Harappan civilization. It is only evidence of local conflicts. Such episodes are found in the myths of all ancient peoples. An additional argument in favor of migration is the influence of Indo-Aryan languages on Finno-Ugric peoples, for example, the ancestors of Hungarians and Finns. This shows that speakers of Indo-European languages lived far to the north before they began moving east and south. Also, the differences within Sanskrit indicate that the Indo-Aryans came to India gradually, not as a single wave. The Vedic texts describe the nature of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India in detail, which indicates a deep awareness of India. Their authors were well informed about these regions. This may indicate that they had been living in the region for several generations. Thus, if migration did occur, it was slow and stretched over centuries rather than being a sudden conquest. The Vedas are not a literal historical document, but rather a religious and mythological source, similar to Homer's Iliad. They may reflect real cultural events, but require careful interpretation. Based on current data, the most likely scenario is a hybrid model. It is likely that some groups of Indo-Aryans did indeed migrate to India, but their arrival was part of a more complex process of cultural interactions. Another way to study the Aryan invasion hypothesis is through genetics. However, this method is complex and ambiguous. Although it makes it possible to identify genetic connections between peoples, it is easy to misinterpret, especially if the analysis is based on small samples. Genetic studies of haplogroups, DNA lines passed down through the male or female line, show that there are indeed genetic connections between the modern peoples of India, Iran, and Europe. However, their degree varies depending on the region. The population of northern India, where Indo-European languages are widespread, shows more similarities with Indo-European populations than the population of the south, which speaks Dravidian languages. But it's important to understand that these genetic connections do not prove when and how the population movements occurred. For example, the similarities found may be the result of later migrations or even reverse movements of peoples. So, drawing firm conclusions from genetics is difficult. Linguistics provides additional information, allowing us to study the movements of peoples not only through ancient texts, but also through the spread of languages. In the Dravidian languages of southern India, borrowings from Indo-European languages have been found. In some regions of northern India and Pakistan, there are still small groups of Dravidian language speakers. This may indicate that the Dravidians were originally more widely spread before the arrival of the Indo-Aryans. An interesting research method is the analysis of plant names in the languages of the region. It shows that the speakers of Indo-European languages gradually settled central India. The study of toponyms also indicates the presence of pre-Indo-European populations in areas that are now considered Indo-European. Genetic and linguistic studies point to different waves of migration, but they do not provide a precise answer as to how and why they happened. Several conclusions can be drawn from this. First, there was no completely local Indo-Aryan population in India. Most likely their ancestors came from outside, but this process took a long time. Second, there was no single massive invasion, as the Aryan invasion theory of the 19th century suggested. Third, the migration was gradual, and the peoples involved in this process probably split into groups, making stops along the way before finally settling in South Asia. The main difficulty is that the exact timing of these migrations remains unclear. However, the available data does not support the hypothesis of a sudden military conquest, which, according to the classical Aryan invasion theory, was supposed to have occurred at the end of the Bronze Age. Archaeology is the most important tool for studying the past. It provides material evidence that, when properly analyzed, helps confirm or refute the reliability of written sources. One way to test the Aryan invasion hypothesis is to study the archaeological and economic data related to the mature Harappan period and its decline. Excavations show that the Indus civilization maintained trade relations with the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, a culture that some scholars associate with the early Indo-Aryans. Moreover, there is evidence of migration of the inhabitants of the Indus Valley to the north, into the regions that would later become Indo-Aryan lands. For example, the Harappan trading colony of Shortugai, located in present-day Afghanistan, was used for the extraction of lapis lazuli, which confirms contacts between civilizations. However, there is still no clear evidence that the inhabitants of Bactria Margiana migrated in significant numbers to the Indus Valley. One of the indirect arguments against the hypothesis of a sudden conquest is the lack of archaeological evidence of destructive raids. Unlike many Indo-European cultures that used war chariots, there is no evidence of military invasions or large-scale destruction in the Indus civilization, even during its period of decline. Instead of city destruction, archaeological data show a slow departure from traditional cultural practices. The urban traditions of Harappa and Rakhigarhi gradually declined. Artifacts become local in style, and complex international trade connections disappear. New religious rituals appear, including the use of horses in ceremonies, which may indicate Indo-Aryan influence. Local traditions are preserved, but new cultural elements can be traced in them. Thus, we see not a sharp break, but a gradual shift. The process is called creolization, the formation of new ethnic groups and cultures based on the blending of different traditions. Similar phenomena have occurred repeatedly in the history of South Asia. For example, during the arrival of the Mughals, the new elite introduced significant changes, but at the same time did not erase local traditions. The last type of evidence we will consider concerns religion and rituals. Unlike the philological analysis of the Vedas, which studies their linguistic structure, here the combination of written and archaeological data related to religious objects is important to understand whether they can shed light on the Aryan invasion hypothesis. One of the key questions is the figure of Shiva, whom some researchers consider to be a link between the Indus Valley civilization and the Vedic tradition. In favor of this, they cite the famous Pashupati seal, which depicts a three-faced man in a lotus pose and stone pillars resembling lingams, symbols of Shiva in later cultures. However, these artifacts remain controversial, as their exact purpose is unknown, and Shiva himself is hardly mentioned in the Vedas. In the Vedic period, the god Rudra was more closely associated with him, and the worship of Rudra was different from the later culture. Shiva. Another important element of religious practices is the ritual drink soma, which is described in the Vedas. Some scholars associate its origin with Bactria and Margiana, where vessels presumably used for its preparation have been found. However, there is no clear archaeological evidence that soma actually originated from there. In the late Harappan period, some elements of Vedism appear. Some rituals, for example, horse burials, which are a characteristic practice among Indo-European peoples. Water purification rituals, common in the later Indus culture, may also have had their roots in the traditions of the Indus civilization. This evidence points to a complex intertwining of ritual traditions. Some rituals probably came from Central Asia, while others, on the contrary, were inherited from local cultures. As a result, there was a slow merging of Vedic and Harappan beliefs, which led to the formation of the religious tradition of the Iron Age. Thus, religious data do not provide clear confirmation of either the Aryan invasion hypothesis or the concept of a completely autochthonous origin of the Indo-Aryans. The available evidence points not to a sudden conquest, but to a prolonged and uneven interaction between migrants and the local population. Both groups were internally diverse, coexisted, exchanged traditions, and ultimately formed new cultural communities. The religious and cultural traditions of ancient India are hybrid, combining both local and Aryan elements. This confirms that simple migration models do not explain the whole picture. The history of South Asia has always been dynamic, multi-layered, and open to influence. Instead of viewing Bronze Age migrations as the only significant event, or insisting on the myth of completely indigenous Aryans, it is important to recognize the complexity and richness of India's historical heritage. Processes of displacement and cultural synthesis have taken place throughout the region's history, from the Indus Valley civilization to the era of the Great Mughals. Perhaps the main lesson to be learned from the history of India lies in its incredible cultural and ethnic diversity, which cannot be reduced to a single simple theory. That's all from me. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video. Bye.